You needed to hear this word today. Jesus said this, Maranatha, come Lord. There is a word that was never meant to fade, a word so old it did not come from Hebrew, and it did not come from Greek. It came from Aramaic, the language Jesus himself spoke every day of his life on earth. This word carried a promise that outlasted the cross, outlasted the empty tomb, and outlasted every generation of believers who whispered it while they waited. Today, you are going to hear this word again, exactly as it was first spoken. And once you do, waiting may never feel the same to you. Because this is not a word about giving up. It is a word about who is still coming for you. For centuries, the institutional church soughed the raw, urgent cry of the earliest Aramaic-speaking believers, translating their language into Latin and Greek formulas that read beautifully, but lost the desperate hope carried in the original sound. Then, in 1945, near the town of Hammadi in Egypt, a farmer digging in the sand struck a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus books, Gnostic Gospels, texts never permitted into the official Bible. Among their pages, scholars found the raw Aramaic prayers of Jesus' earliest followers, preserved exactly as they were once spoken. This was not legend. This was not speculation, passed down by candlelight. This was a documented archaeological discovery, catalogued, translated, and studied by historians who confirmed what many suspected for generations, that something essential had been left out of the story we were given. Why does it matter that this word survived in its original Aramaic form? Because Aramaic was not simply a language of meaning. It was understood in the ancient Near East as a language of vibration, a language where the sound itself carried weight, intention, and force, independent of translation. When the earliest believers, the very people who had once heard Jesus speak Aramaic with their own ears, cried out in that same tongue, they were not only expressing an idea to the mind, they were releasing a frequency of hope into their own bodies, and into the bodies of everyone who heard them. This is why the exact word, and its exact pronunciation, matters so deeply in this teaching. Scholars who study these Nag Hammadi texts describe pronouncing the original Aramaic correctly as something closer to activation than recitation, as if the sound itself reconnects the listener with something ancient encoded into memory, into breath, into the very cells of the body. One of these preserved words is Maranatha, pronounced Maranath, meaning come. Lord, you will find it recorded in the Apostle Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, chapter 16, written in Aramaic within a Greek text, left untranslated on purpose. It was the cry of the earliest Aramaic-speaking followers of Jesus, who had personally heard I am promise he would return, and it captured, in 2 words, everything they refused to stop believing while they waited. This was not a word of despair. It was not spoken by people who had given up. It was spoken by people who had every reason to feel forgotten, scattered, and far from certain, and who chose, in the face of all of that, to keep declaring that he was still coming. This is the pattern we are about to walk through together, because whatever season of waiting you are standing in right now may be waiting for the exact same word. Think, for a moment, about what it actually means to wait for something you cannot see, cannot touch, and cannot rush. This was the exact position of the earliest believers who first spoke Maranatha. They had watched Jesus ascend into the sky, his promise still ringing in their ears, and then they had to return to ordinary life, to hostile cities, to years and eventually decades of waiting, with no guarantee of when the promise would be kept. This is the part of the story that gets overlooked. Maranatha was not a passive sigh of resignation. It was a declaration spoken with full conviction, backed by people who refused to let delay convince them that the promise had quietly expired. They did not stop believing simply because the waiting had lasted longer than they expected. Some seasons of waiting are old. Some have lasted since a diagnosis, since a prayer that still feels unanswered, since a dream you buried because the timing never seemed to arrive. But notice what those early believers did not do. They did not wait in silence. They did not require certainty about the exact day before they spoke the word. They simply declared it, together, out loud, again and again, whenever they gathered. This is a pattern worth sitting with, because so many of us go quiet in our waiting, when the earliest followers of Jesus did the opposite. they got louder. Maybe your own waiting has stretched far longer than you expected. A prayer you stopped saying out loud because it started to feel foolish. A promise you once believed, now sitting quietly in the back of your mind. The believers who first cried out Maranatha were not immune to that same discouragement. They simply refused to let the silence of unanswered time become the final word on what they believed. Maranatha, again, pronounced Maranat, meaning come. Lord was never spoken after the promise was fulfilled. It was spoken precisely because it had not been fulfilled yet. That is the order that matters here. The word came during the waiting, not after it. And this order is not an accident of history. It is, according to those who study these early Aramaic prayers, the entire mechanism behind why this word still carries such force today. If this teaching already feels this deep, imagine having a full guide with deeper explanations of JESUS's true teachings in Aramaic. You'll find the link to the study guide in the comments. There is something else waiting inside this word, something we have not touched on yet, a detail about why the earliest believers refused to translate it into Greek even when they easily could have. We will get to it in the chapters still ahead, and the best is yet to come. In the next chapters, you'll discover what could change everything for you. Because there is a reason the Apostle Paul, writing in fluent Greek to a Greek-speaking city, chose to leave one phrase completely untranslated. Paul could translate anything. He was a scholar, trained in both worlds, capable of rendering any Aramaic phrase into elegant Greek without losing a shade of meaning. And yet, when he reached this particular word, he stopped translating and simply transliterated the sound, letter for letter exactly, as JESUS's first followers had cried it out. Scholars have puzzled over this decision for centuries because it was clearly deliberate. The most convincing explanation is the same one we touched on in Chapter 1. This word did not function only as information. It functioned as a password, a shared cry recognized instantly by anyone who had once stood among JESUS's earliest followers, regardless of what city they now lived in or what language surrounded them daily. To translate it would have been to turn a living cry into a dead definition. Paul understood that some truths lose their pulse the moment they are explained instead of spoken. This tells us something important about how the earliest church actually operated. They were scattered across the empire, cut off from one another by distance, language, and persecution. And yet this single Aramaic phrase traveled with them everywhere, stitching together believers who might never meet in person, all declaring the same untranslated cry. It was not simply a prayer. It was an identity marker, a way of recognizing family in the middle of a hostile world. And this is where the theme of this teaching becomes personal for you. Waiting alone is difficult. Waiting in isolation, convinced no one else understands your specific delay. Your specific ache is even arther. But Maranatha was never meant to be spoken in isolation. It was a communal cry, spoken by people who reminded each other, again and again, that they were not waiting alone, and that the same promise Jesus made to one of them was made to all of them. Perhaps the reason this word has resurfaced now, after 2,000 years, buried beneath translation and time, is because waiting has not gone anywhere. People are still standing in exactly the position those early believers stood in, watching the sky, holding a promise that has not yet visibly arrived, wondering if it is still safe to keep believing it out loud. And perhaps the reason it feels so strangely familiar the moment you hear it correctly pronounced is that some part of you has been waiting to say it too. There is one more detail worth sitting with before we move forward. Something easy to miss on a first reading of 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul places this untranslated Aramaic cry at the very end of his letter, almost as a closing seal. After pages of practical instruction about giving, about gathering, about ordinary church life, it reads, at first glance, like an afterthought. It was not. Ancient letters often closed with a summary of everything that mattered most, a final line meant to be remembered longer than anything else in the letter. Paul buried instructions about money and logistics in the middle of the letter, but he saved this cry, Maranatha, for the very last line believers would read before setting the letter down. He wanted it to be the thing that stayed with them. This tells you something about priority. Whatever practical matters were pressing that congregation, Whatever disagreements, whatever daily concerns filled most of the letter, Paul made certain the final word they carried away was not about any of that. It was about the promise. It was about Jesus, still coming, and their refusal to let anything else become the last word on their situation. Consider what it might mean to close out your own days the same way, not ending each day consumed by whatever went wrong, whatever still feels unresolved, whatever practical weight pressed on you since morning, but instead choosing, deliberately, to let the final thought before sleep be the same one those early believers protected at the end of their letters. Jesus is still coming. He has not forgotten the promise, even if the waiting has stretched longer than you expected, and even if today did not go the way you had hoped it would. This is not a suggestion to ignore what is difficult in your life. It is a suggestion about what gets to have the final word. Paul did not pretend the church in Corinth had no problems. Entire chapters of his letter addressed them directly, but he refused to let the letter close on a note of unresolved difficulty. He closed it on Maranatha, and in doing so, he taught an entire generation of believers how to close their own days, their own seasons of waiting, their own hardest chapters, with a declaration instead of a complaint. Right now, you might be asking yourself, why am I only discovering this truth now? Don't worry. We thought about that. We're here to help you go deeper with a guide made for this journey. The link is in the comments. There is one more layer to this word that deserves to be spoken plainly before we close. The grammar of Maranatha itself carries a subtle but important detail scholars have debated for generations. Depending on where the word is divided, it can be read two ways, either as a declaration, "Our Lord has come," or as a plea, "Our Lord, come." Some of the earliest manuscripts appear to hold both meanings at once, as though the earliest believers refused to separate the two. This matters more than it might first appear. It means the earliest followers of Jesus were not simply waiting for something that had not happened yet. They were also declaring, in the same breath, that He had already come once, that the promise had already proven true, and that this history gave them reason to trust it would prove true again. They were not waiting on a stranger. They were waiting on someone who had already kept his word. This changes how waiting is supposed to feel. It is easy to wait anxiously for something with no track record, no precedent, nothing to anchor your confidence to. But that was never the position of the earliest church, and it is not your position either. Whatever you are waiting for right now sits inside a much longer story, one where Jesus has already shown, repeatedly, that He keeps His promises, even when the timing does not match what anyone expected. Look back over your own life, and you will likely find the same pattern. Promises that once felt impossibly delayed, and yet, eventually, kept. This is why Maranatha was never a cry of uncertainty. It was a cry built on memory, looking backward at what had already been fulfilled, and forward at what was still to come, refusing to let the gap between the two convince anyone that the promise had quietly died. You are being invited into that same posture now, remembering what has already proven faithful in your own life, and letting that memory steady you while you wait for what has not arrived yet. There is a kind of confidence that only grows in people who have waited before and watched the promise keep. It does not come from certainty about timing. It comes from a track record too consistent to ignore. Jesus is not asking you to believe blindly. He is asking you to remember, and to let that remembering carry you forward into whatever remains unfinished. We are just scratching the surface of this ancient power. Get ready, because in our next video, I will reveal even deeper Aramaic codes that unlock spiritual authority you've never imagined. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss this unfolding revelation. This is your transformation protocol. A practice, not a one-time prayer. Ayach Ebening. Before you close out your day, find one private moment, away from screens, away from noise, the same kind of stillness the earliest believers sought when they gathered to speak this word together. In that moment, speak it aloud. Once, with conviction, Maranatha, pronounced Maranatha, meaning, "Come, Lord." Do not whisper it as a question. Speak it as a declaration, the way the earliest church spoke it, remembering both what Jesus already fulfilled and what He has promised is still coming. Then name, silently or aloud, the one thing you have been waiting on the longest. Do not rush past this step. Let yourself actually name it, the way those early believers named their own waiting without shame. And as you do, remember that this word was never meant to be spoken once and forgotten. It is meant to close out your hardest days, your longest seasons, your most uncertain moments, the same way Paul let it close out an entire letter. Repeat this each evening for the next 7 days, not as an obligation, but as a declaration renewed nightly, letting the promise, rather than the day's disappointments, have the final word before you sleep. Jesus has not forgotten what He promised you, and the same conviction that carried the earliest church through decades of waiting is available to carry you through whatever season you are standing in tonight. Just a quick reminder, the transformation guides for a fuller life are waiting for you, right there in the comments. Before you leave, if this message touched your heart or brought new understanding into your life, WRITE, the word restoration in the comments below. Your testimony may encourage someone else who is seeking healing and renewal. Thank you for sharing this moment of ancient wisdom with us. Until the next revelation, walk in peace, walk in freedom, and walk in the power of Maranatha. He is still coming.